everyone. Welcome to the Next Take podcast with Tanika. It's just me today, but I do have a guest with me to discuss a very important topic. So I have Ken W. Good with me today, and we're going to be talking about bail reform. So hi, Ken. Thank you for coming on to the podcast and talking about a very important topic that definitely needs to be discussed. So do you want to do any introductions before we get into it? Kind of what led you to this very important topic that we're going to be talking about.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me or allowing me to come on your show and talk about this issue.
Absolutely.
I would say I've been an attorney for over 30-something years. I kind of feel old just saying that, but I have always kind of had an appellate mind. I used to be board certified in civil appellate law. I just don't do enough appeals to keep it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so a friend of mine asked me to go to a hearing a long time ago now, and it was in a case called Harris County or O'Donnell versus Harris County, which was one of the first cases for bail reform in the United States. It was the first big case. And I sat through the hearing and I became very worried because I thought the judge was going off track. She was making decisions that I thought were incorrect. And so I came out of that hearing sounding the alarm to the bail industry that I thought that case was going sideways and that they need to be aware of it. And it did, and it became a national story, and it has influenced bail reform throughout the United States. The only problem is the Fifth Circuit kept reversing the case and ultimately reversed it and said it should have never been filed in federal court. And I would say that I was ultimately right about the judge's decisions because I think she's been overruled 6 or 7 or 8 or more times in that case. And so I have so as a result of that, I've set out to become knowledgeable, maybe an expert on those issues. I've written a lot of articles on them and, how they should be applied or under the federal and state constitutions, especially Texas. And so that's probably the way it came about. And then I just speak on these issues and write articles on these issues.
Well, that's incredible because again, like we are a Canadian-based podcast, but I'm definitely a person who sees kind of what's going on in the States, especially when it comes to bail reform. And just with inmates being able to actually come out of prison and be contributing people of society. And sometimes it's not being the case and that being the system. And I think with bail, I mean, there's a lot of things that needs to be changed or reformed. And so kind of one thing I kind of wanted to get your opinion on is kind of the impact with bail or cash bail with respect to people of color.
Mm-hmm.
And again, because cash bail is very different here in Canada
Yes.
than it is in the States. And we don't have it doesn't look at all the same. We don't have cash bail or having to have a certain percentage that needs to be paid or whatever. We don't have that here. So what's kind of your opinion on when you have these cash bails of people of color who sometimes, 9 times out of 10, are from poor neighborhoods who can't always afford that percentage that needs to be paid?
Well, that is a can of worms, and it's a can of worms that I have looked at in detail. And so let me kind of just make some general points, and then we can talk specifically about some of them maybe. But I think that one of the low-hanging fruit talking points is the people of color in prisons or in jails across the United States. And I think that is where we get a lot of the push for change is because this talking point that you mentioned. And I would say, okay, I'm not, let's, let's don't criticize or say it's correct or incorrect. Let's just say, let's assume for the moment that we have a disproportionate amount of crime in our minority communities, and
Right.
that by and large, our crime is committed usually minority on minority. Like 50% of all murder victims in the United States are young Black males, and by and large, they're the people committing the crime is usually young Black males.
Yes.
So if you agree that we have a disproportionate amount of crime being committed on our minority communities, then policies that favor, because they're saying that our minority communities are getting mistreated in the legal system, well, then if we're incorrect on that assumption, then who's getting hurt the worst by those policies? The very communities that we say that we are trying to help,
Hmm.
because they get released more quickly because we're addressing some supposed past problems. And as a result, they get released right back into the communities, and they see that as a green light to commit more crime.
Hmm.
We do have studies now. Minnesota has released a study in the last couple of years where they have tracked people from who was the person calling in the crime all the way through to disposition of the person who was accused of the crime. And what they found was by 10 to 1, they have a disproportionate number of crimes being reported by minority communities against minority communities. So that accounts for the disproportionate number of people arrested from minority groups. But the problem is it's not a problem, but once they get into the legal system, then their results are probably better than people who are not in those minority groups. So their data showed that there was a disproportionate amount of crime being committed by certain minority groups. Well, once they got into the legal system, they were treated better than people that were not from those minority groups. And so that's not a one-off. We have multiple groups of data showing that. And so my first response is, do our minority communities not deserve public safety?
Right.
And so when we're talking about that, uh, we need to keep that in mind. And I know for your Canadian listeners, bail is very different in
Yeah.
Canada.
Yeah.
It's very much, I know Canada, the federal government kind of regulates bail for all of the provinces or the entire country, where that's not true in the United States.
Right.
Each state regulates its own bail, but the federal government has its own system. So
Hmm.
federal government system is probably more like the Canadian system, and it's more like a release or detain system. The difference is, I think, what makes that maybe more work better is I think the federal governments are better at uh, holding people accountable if they don't show up for court. Um, the states in Texas, when they get to these simple release mechanisms where they're just releasing people like on a summons, like that's one of the ways you would see it in Canada, or just simple release, like in Texas, we call it, you just released on a personal bond, which is your personal promise that you'll show up. If
Right.
you don't put accountability with that, well, then people see that as a green light to commit more crime. Like in Houston, Texas, when somebody fails to show up 17 times, and nobody does anything to them and they just keep getting another personal bond, which is another personal promise, well, then they're going to see that as a green light to commit more crime, and they will commit
Absolutely.
more crime. And so if you are not, or you are refused to put accountability with it, that's going to be where, the rubber doesn't meet the road.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I 100% agree with that. You know, when you kind of see, with true crime, for example, I'm a person who watches and listens things with true crime. That's kind of the same thing. It's like when you see a person who's committed not necessarily a murder at that point, but maybe some sort of heinous crime and they get
Yeah.
away with it in some
Well,
degree, or they get kind of a slap on the wrist kind of thing. It's
but
kind of
like
like,
in our Constitution, in the Texas Constitution, everyone has a right to release on a bond with sufficient sureties. That doesn't mean they have a right to release. That means they have a right to release on bond.
Hmm.
unless it's certain crimes, and our Texas Constitution sets out crimes that the trial court has the right to hold you, and one of them is capital murder. And so I
Yes.
think that is a big difference. I think from my rough review and quick review of Canada, it seems like everybody has a right to release, and you don't have that in the United States. And
Yeah.
in our federal system, which is, I think, a big difference from your system, there's a presumption to detain people. And I think in your system, the prosecutor has the burden of proof at all times. And so, like, since our federal system is the most like the Canadian system, we currently would detain 75% of the people on average that are arrested under federal charges. And Canada, I don't care what your crime rate is, you can't afford to detain 75% of the people who are arrested.
Yeah. When it comes to the Canadian system, I mean, again, if you're committing a murder or some form of heinous crime, um, you're most likely going to not get out on bond in those cases. But when it comes to other cases, depending on what it is and whether or not you're also a repeat offender is probably partially a part of that as well. Um, you're gonna get released on bond
Or just
and
released by the
surety,
police officer or
or is
release in
released by the police
term.
officer. Yeah, we've talked about it in previous episodes as well when it comes to our judicial system here in Canada, especially when it comes to our sentencing. Um, I know there's some people who may feel differently, but I'm kind of the person that thinks, you know, when you are committing heinous crimes, America, I feel, gets it a little bit more right than we do. Um, if you're committing, if you're getting charged and you are then sentenced with, the first degree murder, you don't get the right to come back out again. And
Well,
that's
I
unfortunately
think,
what we do here.
well, I think in Texas, I mean, in the United States, it's just going to depend on where you are, on
Yeah.
how you're going to be treated by the criminal justice system. And that's one of the problems that we have currently because it's kind of undermining the public's faith in the criminal justice system. Like we have prosecutors in our urban areas that have decided they've been elected with the support of a specific group and that group requires them to do certain things which are less on crime. And an example of them is the current DA in LA County in California. And so
Mm,
LA did Proposition 47 several years ago, and that was to change certain felonies to misdemeanors. One of them was theft under $950. Well, the DA in LA County said, well, now that that's a misdemeanor, we're no longer going to prosecute that. Well, so now theft under $950 is just running amok in LA
yeah.
County. And, you've got stores closing because they can't withstand
Right.
$25,000 a day in shoplifting. You got
Yeah.
in San Francisco, you've got commercial buildings that are selling for 30%, 50% of their value just a couple of years ago. And
Mm.
you've gone from a 5% default rate on those on commercial property loans to like a 40% now. And so that's not sustainable. So, and there's a proposition on the ballot in November to maybe not repeal, but fundamentally change the previous Prop 47. And Gascon, who's the DA in LA County, he only pulled 25% in the primary. He made it to the final round, but I would be surprised if the champion of decriminalization got reelected with the same thing on the with the ballot initiative to repeal or greatly amend the old Prop 47, which he championed.
Yeah. I would also be surprised if, like, I mean, I feel like, especially with COVID, certain cities in the States would definitely got hit when it came to theft and shoplifting, especially. And then you would lower that to a misdemeanor like that.
Yeah, yeah.
A lot of stores, and not just big box stores, but a lot of stores were suffering because of that. It feels like if I was a shop owner, kind of
Oh
like
yeah.
no one cares about the fact that I'm losing money. This is
Well,
a person's
they started out
livelihood.
by saying this is a victimless crime, and I think what we've learned
But
since
it's
then is
not.
there's all kinds of victims in this, and
Yeah.
the biggest victim that they didn't even think about is grandma and grandpa who are living on fixed incomes.
Yeah.
And now Walgreens is closing. And so the place that they walk to get their prescriptions is gone. And now they have to get on the subway or get on a bus and
Mhm.
ride somewhere. And with crime increasing in these urban areas because we're decriminalizing them because we think we have past problems that we need to address for certain minority groups, and it's having the opposite effect, and we're not looking at this, but we're just ignoring it. I do find it interesting that you commented that really don't have commercial bail or private bail or cash bail in Canada, but there is a large company that is in under Canadian ownership that has a large stake in the United States bail industry, Crum and Forrester. It's a huge uh, bail company in the United States.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, I
I
mean,
did not know
there's been
that.
issues in the past about whether they were going to continue in the market because of their Canadian ownership and the way Canada treats this issue, but they still, I mean, they make a lot of money off of the bail industry in the United States, and so I'm sure they will continue doing so.
Yeah, that is very interesting that us as like a country over here don't really do um bail in the same way. We don't have like the cash bail. Or we have to like do like a percentage, which I never realized until I was in college that was the case. I was actually surprised by that. And I'm like, that's very surprising to hear that even though we don't do that here, that one of a company that's based here is definitely profiting off of cash bail in the States. Like, that's interesting.
Well, I mean, in the States, in Texas, we don't have this federal like marshal system, and probably like in Canada, we don't have a federal ability to hold people accountable. I mean, so
Yeah.
you use different release mechanisms, and they all have different failure to appear rates. Um, so the private industry has the lowest failure to appear rate. That means people are going to show up for court much more often than any other release mechanism. When you do simple release, or we in Canada where you do a summons, in
Mhm.
the United States that would have an incredibly high failure to appear rate, and mostly because there's no accountability if you don't. Because when the more you release on these alternative release mechanisms, your failure to appear rates go up. And in the United States, on a criminal case, if you're not there, in most cases, the case is put on hold until you come back. And so we're always adding, on the average, the same number of cases to the system that we added last time. So, or last year. So if we change the release mechanism and the failure to appear rate goes up, then our backlogs go up. That creates chaos. Chaos is de facto decriminalization. And so de facto decriminalization is a green light to commit more crime.
Yeah. Yeah, and I find that very interesting. I've definitely heard of cases. I'm not sure if we have cases here in Canada, but there are cases, whether older or more recent, that you know someone could just flee a court case and end up in a different state that you know maybe or may not be paying attention to what's happening in the previous state. And I never understood how like that just in so many ways, maybe getting away with this may be the wrong
Mm-hmm.
term to use, but just kind of letting them getting away with the crime that they committed, depending on what that crime is. But how do you feel about in that case with courts kind of just saying, well, we're just going to put this case on hold until this person comes
Well,
back?
I mean, you have a constitutional right to confront your accuser. So, I mean, there's two different things that are fighting each other. You've got the right of the victim to file charges, but you've got the
Right,
right of the accused to confront his accuser. So, if they
right.
decide to run, I mean, you could argue but I think it would require a constitutional amendment that if they run, then that waives the right. But then you're going to have to wait for them to come back to see if they ran or if they were just an idiot and forgot to come and then got scared. And so, I
Hmm.
mean, it just adds more levels to the chaos. I'm not. I mean, I don't know. That's why I think a strong element of accountability is so important. If you
Hmm.
fail to show up for court, you're going to have, if I'm the judge, you're going to probably be held in custody unless you have a really, really good reason why you didn't show up for court. I mean, we have people all the time, and I think Canada has gone through this as well, where the courts have held it has to be a conscious reason to fail to appear for court, not a
Yeah.
stupid reason, like they just
Yes.
overslept. But the problem is both reasons do the same amount of damage to the criminal justice system. The
Hmm.
case is put on hold. They're now dealing with a backlog that's even greater. It has the
Hmm.
same pressure on the as the people who did it consciously. So if I was the judge in that situation, it would be very rare that it would require a really good excuse for me to allow somebody to out on bond again. Uh, or I might try, well, you're going to sit in jail for a week and then we'll try bail again to see if you'll show up next time. But
Hmm.
because that does damage. I mean, I had a judge friend tell me one time, I just tried simple release for, a period of time just to see what the difference was. And she found for every 8 weeks of just simple release, she created a whole new week's worth of work for herself and her court.
Yeah.
So the type of release you use, if you don't have accountability, can completely, I mean, it can prevent the courts from being able to resolve cases. Like in
Hmm.
Harris County right now for misdemeanors, that's Houston, Texas.
Hmm.
They have according to Harris County Court Watch, they have an 80% failure to appear rate. An 80% failure to appear rate. You're going to need to double the courts to be able to resolve the same number of cases, unless you just start dismissing everything, which is what they're doing
Which
to
is what they
prevent the
do. Yeah.
collapse of the criminal justice system.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think for probably more my opinion than anything, but I feel the issue is it's like depending on the crime, like I kind of mentioned before, I feel like certain people do not deserve to enter society while their court case is going
Sure, I agree
through,
with that. Especially if they have a criminal history. Like
especially if they have a criminal history.
we've had this whole argument in the United States. Well, we need to change the way we do bail because it's going to be held unconstitutional. Well, we've had two federal courts of appeals hold it constitutional now. So that argument's now dead. And so
Hmm.
now they're arguing, well, we just need to do something more fair, which is kind of like the argument or the first question you came out with is that fair? And I'm like, we have the fairest system in the world. Maybe it needs to be improved. And the way we improve it is if you say you're poor and you can't afford the bail that's set by the court or the judge, well, then you have the right to say, hey, I can't afford that. And he or she is to take that into consideration. But it's not the trump card. If you have a criminal history, then you're not in jail because they set bail at an amount you can't afford. They set bail representing your criminal history. And if you can't afford that, well, then that's not a lack of ability to pay. That's your criminal history
Right.
requiring you to, I mean, that's just what your criminal history requires. I see that as a big difference between the United States and Canada right now, and maybe Texas and Canada specifically, but because I think Canada, the ability to pay kind of trumps uh, the other considerations sometimes. And in the United States and Texas specifically, the
Yeah.
courts have held it's only one consideration of all the considerations set out in the statute, and it doesn't trump the rest.
Yeah. Like like I mentioned before with Canada, we are definitely a little more lenient, and that's in all things, whether it's the bail, the bond, the sentencing, and all of that. Um, we're definitely a little bit more lenient when it comes to certain things. And that's a whole other topic, a whole other conversation that
Well,
I can
and I
definitely
mean,
get into.
yeah, and
Yeah.
yeah, and some of those are cultural changes as well, are differences.
Yeah.
And even across the United States, we have cultural differences that affect bail. That's, one of the reasons, we're talking about changing the way bail is done in Texas and over the way it's done currently. And one of my arguments is, we've got 254 counties in the state of Texas. I mean,
Mhm.
did we really want to change the way 254 counties are currently doing it? And because one county doesn't like the way it's currently being done. I don't see that passing. And I'm not really sure that that one county has a problem. I just think politics are coming to play in it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I can understand that. Um, and I guess that also just to kind of add to the other thing I was going to say as well, um, I was talking about my, uh, certain crimes and whatnot.
Mhm.
Um, but if those people, personally for me, if those people who maybe are being charged with some sort of drug crime and they potentially could um, have a history and they're being let out on bail, they pay the bail, they're supposed to come back to their crime, to the court case or whatever. Well, personally, if someone isn't showing up to a court case
Mhm.
um, of that caliber, chances are, like, if they're a reasonable person, they're probably going to say, oh, by the way, like maybe that day or the next day, I missed my court case and here's why. If a person is trying to run, they're not going to call to say, by the way, I didn't make this court case. So I don't know like what changes could be really done to, because the problem is it's like you want to be fair to the general public, but then there's always those few bad eggs that
Well,
kind of
let me state it a
spoil it.
different. Let me state it a different way. You've got, um, and this is an area where politics is really killing the criminal justice system when it comes to the area
Yeah.
of drugs.
Yeah.
Because let me give you an example. So you've got a person who's arrested in possession of drugs. Okay, so we've got the college frat boy.
Mm,
Okay, I mean, that's very that's much more persuasive than okay, it was his dealer and he was arrested with 20 pounds of fentanyl.
right.
But the problem is we're tying the hands of judges because the argument is, well, it's drugs. We've lost the war on drugs and we just need to move on. Well, like our urban areas, these DAs that are more progressive are not filing the uh, the extra charges based on weight. So they're not doing the forgot. I can't think of the name of it, but they can file additional charges based on the 40 pounds. And
Hmm.
so they're treating both defendants the same. They get two
Mm-hmm.
weeks, or they get a week, or they get probation. Nothing. I mean, they really get a slap on the wrist. Well,
Mm-hmm.
and we're doing that to tie the hands of the judges in the name of the frat boy. And when we do that, we're preventing them from addressing organized crime, gangs, and career criminals. And so the career criminals go, hey, 2 weeks, that's a cost of doing business. And we can't address them. And if we're really truly going to give up on all drug crimes, I mean, there's some articles that say 80% of all crime in the in our country and probably Canada as well is some type of relationship to drugs. So if we're
Absolutely.
giving up on drug crime, we're giving up on crime.
I 100% agree with that. Like, if we're talking about weed, whatever. I mean, I know not every state has legalized weed. Um, Federally here, though, we've legalized weed recently. So weed, to me, is
Here's the problem we're having with that right now. And I just did a
hmm
podcast on it and I haven't even released it yet. But so Canada has legalized weed and we're going to make all this money out of, taxing the weed industry. Well,
yeah,
the legal weed industry in California has failed and it's being taken over by cartels. And so
interesting.
any tax money they're making off of or made off of that, they're now spending to try to eradicate the cartels who have moved in. So we no longer have a cartel trying to wash their money through industries in the United States. They're moving their manufacturing everything into the United States
Hmm.
and making a killing with it. And we've got to address that somehow. We cannot have this legalization of marijuana and then have the market taken over by the cartels. And then it's
Yeah.
just become, I mean, and they're fine with it because we'll bring all of our workers here. They'll all be illegal, but I mean, you've decriminalized it. So if you arrest us for making marijuana, what are you going to do to us?
Well, see, that's the thing. It's like that's the sticky part with weed. Listen, like if you want to, I don't have, I personally do not smoke weed. I do not
Mhm.
partake in any sort of drug. I mean, I barely drink, but if you choose to smoke it, fine. If you need to take some sort of gummy or whatever, fine.
Isn't that the same argument we made with cigarettes many, 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 many
Oh
years
man,
ago? And now we're saying cigarettes are not good for you. I mean, I don't know the difference between smoking your lungs from marijuana and smoking your lungs from cigarettes,
I don't know.
but I mean, I know there's not nicotine, there's not that kind of stuff, but I
Yeah,
think 20 years from now, we're going to be seeing a lot more arguments because I think that that issue when a legalization was really driven by politics and money, not by a really ar- an, a smart argument.
yeah, that's the thing. It's like the stuff that is put in, if you are smoking it, mainly you're talking about smoking it. If there's so much crap put in those things that you're not just smoking pure weed. There's some health benefits, some, you can combat pain if you have whatever. But I know, like, again, I don't smoke, but I was married to a man many years ago now who is from Jamaica, and smoking weed here in Canada was not the same for him as smoking it in Jamaica. He said it's a lot more pure. But here's the other thing that I'll say to that. Pure or not, my ex-husband is a dummy. And I wonder if that's partially because he's maybe killed some brain cells with weed smoking. So, but neither here nor there. If you choose to smoke, that's fine. But I feel like the issue needs to be still put in, if you're selling it, on the street, or like something to that effect, because what if that weed is laced with fentanyl?
Yeah, that was the point I was going to make is these illegal distribution systems, fentanyl is so cheap that it's being mixed with anything and everything. And,
Exactly.
you're like, why would they do it? It's all about the money. I mean, they
Yeah.
can, I mean, it's so cheap to add fentanyl to anything. And if they do it in the wrong, I mean, why would you risk that? I mean, just set aside the whole concept of that, your body is a temple to God, and why would you put something in your temple to God that, you don't know anything about where it came from, and why would you do
Yeah.
that? Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
And that's the thing. People are, especially young kids, young adults, are dying
yeah.
because they are putting something in their body that they think is purely this one thing, but then there's also that fentanyl where it only takes a little bit to,
Well, and
have
we're in
that
this period of
forward.
time where we have decriminalized marijuana, like in Canada and some places in the United States, and so that happens, and so it is really difficult in that situation because you are fighting competing interests. If you want to prosecute that person, uh, but then you've got the whole decriminalization of marijuana industry against you. And then you've got, the family of the victim wanting justice. And where's the middle ground? And I would say right now there's not one. And the politics is the reason for that. I mean, there is a middle ground on that. Even if you don't, if you want to criminalize it, if you don't, then there's a clear path to resolve this. I mean, if you're mixing something with a drug that's illegal and it kills somebody, then you're responsible for that. Then you can be
Absolutely.
charged for that. But I think the politics has really harmed that, and you see that in Canada, and you see that in parts of our urban areas in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I felt like our country legalizing marijuana, again, sorry to some listeners who are perfectly happy and content with us legalizing marijuana in this country. I, I, uh, I was not for it.
Mm-mm, mm-mm.
I thought it was a bad idea. Someone can smoke weed out on the street if they want to. And again, I work in Toronto, so Toronto is, there's not a lot of places where you can go to get open air away from a smoker, whether it's cigarette or weed or whatever. I do not choose to inhale that, and I don't want to inhale that. Um, So it's like you're worrying about the people who want to have this legalized, and that's fine. But you're not thinking about
Well,
the
isn't
people who
that's kind of
don't.
the good point? I mean, that's the impact of this decriminalization movement. You suffer the consequences of it,
Hmm.
whether you agree with it or not,
Yeah.
and you're not really given the opportunity to say, look, what's if they want to do it? I mean, even if that's you want to say, well, if they want to do it, that's fine, but I don't. Well, you're kind of being forced at points in time if you're
Yeah.
around secondhand smoke, and
Yeah.
that's kind of the thought behind a lot of these changes. I mean, look at, okay, we're going to decriminalize theft under $950 and look at the consequences. People who didn't agree with it, or people that would say, well, I would never do that. But, I can understand somebody who needs food on their table. Well, organized crime has stepped in and learned how to make millions of dollars off of this poor decision that wasn't thought through. And
Hmm.
people are having to live with the bad consequences of it. And it's all politics. And I mean, we always have politics in the criminal justice system. I mean, anytime you have a
Yeah.
new law, it's a political, but the level of politics right now is so bad. I mean, in the United States, we kind of repeat, we have a cycle that we go through. In the 60s, we felt safe, so we were more forgiving on our criminal laws. We had crime start going up, and then we would have a fight between the two political parties. One would refuse to participate in addressing it, so nothing would get done, and we would have a backlash. And then that's how we got Reagan with the war on crime. And then now we're in the middle of this cycle again. We felt safe, we were more forgiving, crime is going up,
Hmm.
and put on steroids during COVID, and now you see the beneficiaries of that is the urban areas, and we have DAs that are being removed from office and losing elections as a result. And we still have this one group that's supporting DAs running for offices, and when they get elected, they make them a quid pro quo to agree to double down on these types of policies, which then turn around and get them in trouble with the voters.
But yeah, no, I definitely was thinking of asking you, like, obviously, yes, there is a place for politics in the court systems and the criminal system, but uh, I don't know if it should have such a heavy part, such a big hand in you know
Well,
people.
historically in the United States, both parties have been law and order. And
Yeah.
so the fight has been over whether something is a crime, not enforcement of it. But
Hmm.
now we have this divergence among the parties on whether one party believes crime should be prosecuted.
Hmm.
And I mean, there's a whole reason for that. I understand that. I understand. I mean, this whole cycle that we've gone through, where 6 months or 4 months before a national election, we've been, one party has been whipping up uh, an, an a criminal justice issue and having, you know, um, marches, and they've kind of set up a little riot or a mob before
Hmm.
every election. They tell them to come out and vote. They're getting mistreated by the system, and they need to come out in larger numbers to vote. And they needed that to win, and it worked. But now they've lost control of the mob, and they're telling, and the mob is electing what I would call the true believers, because in the past it was just election rhetoric. They would get elected and nothing would change. Now the true believers are telling them, they're getting mistreated. We need to elect people that are going to disproportionately treat minorities differently than other people that are arrested, even if it's for the same crime. And that's historically, we don't treat, I don't know. I mean, there's a whole argument on why we have a disproportionate amount of crime being committed by certain minority groups, and that's historically because we have this dark period of our country where we discounted crime minority on minority. It's like, oh well, that's just between them, and
Yeah.
and so it created this whole um, system where they had vigilante justice because it was all they took care of themselves. Well,
Hmm.
so then when we started treating minority crime just like any other crime, well, it would have a disproportionate amount of crime because they had to look out for themselves. And so an eye for an eye.
Hmm.
And also they have criminal elements that discovered that as long as they were just focusing on their same minority group, they would get away with it more likely. And so we have that whole history that we're having to address, which is some of the reasons why we have disproportionate crime in our minority communities. And if we anytime we have crime increase, it increases quicker on those. I mean, there's a new statistic out talking about Minnesota, and their governor's running for vice president in one of our national parties. And
Hmm.
that's where the whole Black Lives Movement started. And he was very supportive of the Black Lives Movement during the Ferguson, where you want to call it protests or riots. And he
Right.
did call out the National Guard for a period of time. And he's even said because he agreed with them. Well, the statistics and the data shows that crime on the minorities in Minnesota as a result increased by 80% compared to the rest of the country where it increased by 20%. So his policies disproportionately hurt the very minority communities he said he was trying to help. And I think that
Hmm.
that's where you really, I mean, you have to conclude it's just all politics if that's what the data is showing. They're
Right.
just whipping up a community to try to get them to vote for them when what they're advocating is actually hurting them.
Hmm. Yes, I did not know. I did not know. Like I knew, um, the Kamala's vice president choice was a little bit controversial. I did not know that.
Yes.
Um, I mean, as a Black woman, I it's good to see, someone uh try to advocate for the community, for Black people, but you have to do it in such a way where it's not going to be more detrimental to the community. Um, I have my views when it comes to the Black Lives Matter movement. Maybe that would surprise some people. I'm not necessarily, how do I say this, politically correct. I have no issue with what the Black Lives Movement stands for. However, I think with the Black Lives Movement, it's all about, the cop and, Black person situation. And I understand that. And that is a problem that needs to be addressed. But there also is a problem within the Black community killing and hurting each other. And if that's going to make things worse, and that does not need to happen, um, that
Well,
doesn't need to be being made worse. It's already bad.
look, we're always looking to improve the criminal justice system and in
Yeah.
the bail industry. I mean, the bail system needs always, we're on the lookout to improve it. But I'm I'm critical of these movements where we need to treat one minority group differently than the rest in the criminal
Hmm.
justice system. I'm not in favor
Yeah.
of that, and I think that it's never been successful. And the U.S. Supreme Court has said in the past, if we're going to do something like that, it needs to be for a short period of time and have a specific goal. And
Right.
they recently, in the last year, got rid of some of what I would call affirmative action type programs for schools like Harvard, and it was because weren't limited, they didn't have a time, and they weren't specific to just anything. They were just going to this is what they were going to do in the name of diversity. And I mean, I'm not critical of having a diverse college campus. I'm just critical of not having the smartest college campus because these are our leaders of tomorrow. I don't care what race you
Yeah.
are, but I want the smartest people in the college because those are tomorrow's leaders. And
Right.
look at the damage these schools are doing to themselves. Columbia's, which is a school that in the past has had this really great reputation, and a
Right.
large number of their law school graduates have been clerks at the appellate level and the Supreme Court of the United States. And
Mm-hmm.
several judges, I mean, a judge went and spoke there and was, I mean, it was essentially chased off the stage. And, their DEI, diversity, equality, and director came and apologized on the stage for him coming to address them. And so a group of judges announced that they were no longer going to hire clerks from Columbia. And so, what was Columbia's response to that? Did they go, "Oh, we apologize. We needed to address what we're doing. We need to be more." I mean, if we're going to be more diverse, we need to be more accepting of anyone that comes to talk to us. No, they
No,
filed judicial complaints against all the judges that said they would no longer hire people from Columbia. Like they're going to back down. I mean, the one person that I know is not going to back down in a fight is a federal judge. And so all of those um, complaints were dismissed. And so, look at Columbia. It's a very good example of where we are in this little microcosm of this example of criminal justice reform. I mean, Columbia graduates are in a worse place today because now they've pissed off the federal judges even more, the ones that signed this pledge. And there's no way a Columbia grad would be hired right now. And it's all because they picked a fight. They invited a federal judge to come talk, picked a fight with him, wouldn't back down, then filed judicial complaints, and now they've lost. I mean, they've just taken this $200,000-$300,000 that they've spent in Columbia, and they've thrown it away. And I would say it's all political.
yeah, that's unfortunate. I mean, I'm definitely for, especially when you're kind of dealing with, you know, the Harvards or the Yales or whatever. It's like, yes, diversity is important, but diversity, I think, comes into play when you're not going to disparage that Black person whose marks show that they can go to this school. Um, that's where diversity should be coming into play. Don't allow, this white person to go in when their marks are literally the same as the Black person and they're being told they can't go to the school. Don't allow me to go to Harvard or Yale. My marks won't show that I could have gone to a
Well,
school like
or
that.
me.
But
I mean,
yeah.
I'm the vanilla guy. I understand that, but I mean, I was very poor growing up. Everything I've got, I work for and work for very hard.
Hmm.
I'm the, but I would never get accepted to Baylor. I mean,
No,
to Harvard. Would have never been accepted. I mean,
no.
I was from Texas. I was white. I was from a farming community.
Hmm.
I There was only 4 or 5 people from my class that went to college, and my parents were public school teachers, so they taught me the importance of education. And so, I mean, they used to call me a professional student because, I have an undergrad degree with a double major. I have a master's degree and then a law degree. And I'm like, I am not a professional student because a professional student never graduates. I keep graduating. So by definition, that's not a professional student. But that's
And
a
there's a lot of
good,
hard work in becoming a
but that's
lawyer.
a good difference. That's a good difference. We want to reward anyone who's willing to work hard.
Yeah.
We don't want to reward anything. I mean, we don't want to reward complacency, no matter what their race is.
Hmm. Exactly. Yeah, no, I think again, I've had friends who were professional students. It's like, okay, where's the end goal? That's
Yeah.
kind of where that kind of comes in. If you have the end goal, then you kind of go for that. But again, like in your defense, I work for lawyers. I'm an assistant. I'm a clerk. So it's like that's a lot of hard work to become a lawyer.
It is, especially when you're right off the farm, like I was moving pipe and irrigation pipe in the peanut fields. And
Yeah.
so I was behind, my contemporaries when I went to college, but I caught up quickly, and I loved law school. And it was just kind of like a fish finding its, water to swim in. But in the criminal justice system, we have to get out of this mindset of politics over everything else. I mean, if we're
Yeah.
going to make something a crime that needs to be enforced, and maybe we need to have a debate on whether something should be a crime. But what we don't need is like Harris County, Houston, where something is a crime, and then you go right next door to Montgomery County, and it's not, or
Mm-hmm.
vice versa. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, that makes the public think less of the criminal justice system, and we can't have that. We need the public to have faith. And the other problem we have right now is we have one national party that is undermining the U.S. Supreme Court, and they're doing it only for political reasons. They're ruling against their political position, so they're saying that the U.S. Supreme Court is no longer valid, and that undermines the whole system for the country. Anytime you lose at the Supreme Court, it's not because you lost. It's because it's politics now, and
Yeah.
that's not healthy. We need leaders that stand up and say it was a good fight. We presented our arguments. Supreme Court has the final say, and they ruled against us, and we respect their decision, and we will live to fight another
Yeah.
day. I mean, but we can't have that anymore. Well,
Yeah.
everything's illegitimate when you lose, and it's only legitimate when you win. And so
Hmm.
that's the threat to the Supreme Court. We're going to,
Right.
I mean, we've had Supreme Court justices who have been under attack, I mean, physically from people. And it's because of those types of attacks. And it's
Yeah.
intended to influence their rulings. And I mean, like again, I'll say it again. The one person that's not going to back down from a fight is a federal judge, and so
Right.
they need to learn those things and realize that and come up with better tactics that's more healthy for our political system or our government. So when you
Yeah.
have one party that's delegitimizing the whole government, well, then why would you be surprised that after an election you have people that are walking into the Capitol saying we don't agree with the result? I mean, they've
Yeah.
been told that, I mean, both sides were telling them if we don't win, it's illegitimate. Well, that's the whole problem.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with that. I mean, again, in school, when I was studying um, to be a clerk, to be a legal assistant, um, we were told no one is above the law. That includes politicians. That includes, I don't know, the Queen of England or whatever at the
Well,
time when she was alive.
Canada's
Uh,
seen this issue too with the trucker movement. And, they froze
yes,
all their accounts. And I
yes,
mean, it was just a brutal attack on their ability to present their free speech. And it went through the criminal justice. I mean, it went through the legal system in Canada and was
mhm,
found to have been improper, a huge scandal
yes,
that as the way it was presented in the United States.
yes.
And yet the damage was still done.
Yeah. And that's the thing. It's like you're putting out the incorrect message. We'll leave party names and party leaders' names out of
Mhm.
this, but you're putting out the wrong message when you have a court case that started pre-election.
Yeah.
It's run its course. You're found guilty of all charges.
Yeah.
And then you want to basically say, well, it's all fake news.
Yeah. Well,
And
and
it's
it
that's
was done before an
detrimental.
election,
Yes.
and it was to squelch the speech of the opponents of the opposite side. It
Hmm.
worked, and now years later, they're told that they were wrong. So what? They
It's
won.
exactly. It's ridiculous. And it's just
Mhm.
like, uh,
Well, okay, so there's been a period of time in the history in the United States and in Canada when something like that would happen, that party would be punished at the polls. The problem is we're now in a period where they're not being punished at the polls. So
no,
there's no penalty for doing that. The
no.
public won't hold them accountable. And the reason why is like in the United States right now, we've got one guy running for president that even the press, he's been president before and he had good policies, but the press is like everything that we have to do, everything in the world possible to keep him from being president again because he'll ruin our whole country. And then we've had just a few people from the other party going, hey, if he wins, he wins. He's not going to harm the country. His policies were actually good. And
Yeah.
so you've got this little, I mean, it's almost an authorization to do whatever you can to harm one party. Um, and you could even take it to the extreme and say there was an attempt at his life. I mean, was it political? I mean, they just missed him by an inch because they got his
Yeah.
ear. And I mean,
Yeah.
it's just that bad. I mean, the problem is it's so bad right now. You can't say with 100% certainty that it's not political. And you just
Right.
bring all this back to the criminal justice system and all these attacks on the private industry bail system in the United States. The private industry bail system is the low hanging fruit. it's what everybody would like to get rid of. It just seems like it's not fair. But the problem is there is no alternative in the United States that has worked anywhere near that level. If you've got an 80% failure to appear rate in all misdemeanor courts across California, which is what the Yolo County DA told me in a podcast, then you don't have an alternative because they're using, you know, they're using simple release as an alternative to the private industry bail and all misdemeanors. And Harris County, Houston, Texas is doing it for misdemeanors as well and getting a similar result, according to harriscountycourtwatch.com. Well, those aren't alternatives then. If you're no longer using what worked and you're replacing it with something that completely does not work, and it forces you to dismiss record numbers of cases to prevent the criminal justice system from collapsing, that's not an alternative. That's chaos. And
Absolutely.
that's all being driven by politics. And that's what we have to realize and overcome. I mean, come on, guys. Can we not say it's not working, so we need to try something else?
Yeah.
We can't in the United States right now because it's all being driven by politics. And when you say politics, it's being driven by the people who will give you money. And the best
Yep.
example I can give you is Texas. Texas has always been a conservative state, even when it was Democrat controlled.
Hmm.
But right now, to run for statewide office in Texas, you have to take out positions that are more progressive. And to do that, you have to do that to get the money from the donors. But once you do that, you now have the money to run a statewide race, but you made yourself unelectable in Texas because it's a conservative state. So you'll have the money, but you'll still lose by 13, 12 or 13 points.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is the biggest issue. I think, obviously, being Canadian, not obviously dealing with directly being affected by the politics in the States at the moment. Um, but eh, it's it's unfortunate that certain parties, certain people need to have their hand in something that has been in effect for centuries. Yes, there have been changes along the way, but there's a reason why these things are put in place.
Mm.
And it's to ensure that A, the person being accused is getting a fair trial or just fair treatment within the criminal justice system. And B, that the person that's being directly affected by said accused is being heard and not ignored. Definitely
Well, I
depending
would
on what
say
the
it a little
crime
bit
is.
I would say it a little different. The purpose of bail is just to ensure that you're going to return to answer the charges that have been
Yeah.
filed against you. I
Yep.
mean, there's no presumption of innocence in the United States on bail because bail is just what assurance are you giving the court that you're going to come back and answer these charges?
Right.
In our urban areas, we're trying this pinky promise. Okay, we're just going to give you simple release and it's your pinky promise. And if you break it, we'll give you another pinky promise. And then that's where you have 17 times you fail to appear in Harris County and you still get another simple release, pinky promise. And nobody ever does anything to you. Um,
Yeah.
if you give me a pinky promise and don't show up, I'm not going to let you give me another pinky promise if
No.
I'm the judge. But the problem is we have politics setting policies where the judge has no longer has the ability to do anything else other than require them to give them another pinky promise.
Right.
And so we need to make sure that the judges have the discretion to hold people accountable if they don't show up. And if we don't, we need to change the laws. But then once we give them that discretion, then we have to make sure that we're electing judges that will then do that because the politics for the DAs is now bleeding over into the politics of the judges. I mean, Houston is the perfect example. We've got judges who are elected saying we're gonna do all these things, we're going to give in to the plaintiffs that we're suing, and it's been a fiasco. And we're
Yeah.
now slowly replacing those judges who are refuse to follow the law. Really, that's what they're doing. They're refusing to follow the law, and they're putting politics over public safety.
I guess my only other question that I have for you, um, with respect to bail, I mean, I think we kind of talked about this already, but I don't know if you want to elaborate any more on it. Um, is the potential for reoffense, whether that be while you're on bail, after you've completed a sentence and you come back out. Um, what are kind
Well,
of your thoughts with that?
the risk of recidivism, which is what we call that,
Hmm.
is really great on high, depending on the type of release you have in the United States.
Right.
So the Yolo County DA did a study because he kept all this data during COVID, and he compared recidivism for people released on simple release or people released on private industry bail, and found that someone who was released on a simple release mechanism had a 200% greater chance of committing a violent offense in the next 18 months.
Hmm.
I mean, that was someone who was considered to be released on a nonviolent offense originally because they were only releasing nonviolent offenders on this simple release during COVID.
Hmm.
So it just tells you that if you're not going to hold people, if you're relying solely on the private industry to hold people accountable and you switch over to a simple release and you don't even know how to do it, and so you're not doing it, or if you refuse to do it because you're addressing some type of systemic issue that you, that is your justification for doing so, then it has a humongous impact on the system, and it's detrimental, and it increases the pressure to de facto decriminalize crime, but also it will increase violent crime, so it will jeopardize public safety. Um, just based on the type of release you're using in the United States currently.
Hmm. Yeah, and do you have any opinions, thoughts, um, on that kind of what can counteract
Well, first we
people?
have to agree that it's a problem. That's the biggest hurdle with the politics such as it is. We're having this fight about whether recidivism is even increasing as a result of the type of release being used.
Seriously?
And oh yeah, in Harris County and New York and in other areas where recidivism is being brought up by law enforcement,
Hmm.
we have all these games being played with the math. I did a podcast with an assistant DA from New York where he actually showed you how they're doing it with the numbers. So they're taking all crime, just any crime that's being committed, and then they're using the numbers for people who are uh, committing new crimes that are out on bond and showing, oh, it's only 1%, 2%,
Oh, come
3%.
on.
But that's not the way you calculate recidivism. You start with the people who are committing additional crimes. You start with people who fall in that category. So the
Yeah.
way law enforcement calculates recidivism is very different, and it's based on a history of this is how you calculate recidivism. So we've got the politicians involved, and they're cooking the books to say recidivism is not even a problem. So it's not being brought up. It's not being caused by this simple release, and we're seeing it really just as bad on the whole issue of whether crime is going up. Um, you've got, I mean, this is the third election in a row, and we've got one national party saying crime is not going up. I mean, that's just a Republican talking point. And you would think that they couldn't say that this election cycle because the Oakland NAACP came out demanding a state of emergency on crime because it was so bad in Oakland,
Yeah.
California.
Yeah.
And the DA accused them of just repeating a Republican talking point. And so the regional NAACP came out and say, no, crime is a huge problem. And we agree with the local group. And now the DA that said that is the subject of a petition to remove her. And so crime in our urban areas is suffering because of politics and suffering because of these quid pro quos from groups that supported them that doesn't have anything to do with the local community. And I think that, we can't get past the basic fight of whether recidivism is a problem, whether crime is a problem, because they can't. I mean, if they were to admit crime was going up, then they would have to admit all they've done to cause it, and so they have to deny it. They just have to say, "Oh no, no, crime's not going up. No, it's just a Republican talking point." And so we're kind of stuck in that. And that's kind of why I say we're following the same path, the same cycle that we did in the 60s, because that's really what happened there. We had one party that refused to acknowledge there was a problem, refused to help to address it, even though, both sides were the ones that created more laws to be more lenient because we were feeling safe. And so we had a backlash. We're going to have a worse backlash now. And we would have already had it, but we've got one party that's been, you know, eking through elections off of the abortion issue after the Supreme Court ruled, or sent the issue of abortion back to the states and made it not a federal issue. And
Right.
so they may, I mean, the one candidate running for the Democrats that's really her only issue is abortion rights. Even though it's been sent back to the states, she wants to relitigate it, even though it's not even an issue for the president of the United States anymore. But she's saying
Hmm.
elect me will relitigate that issue. Shouldn't have any positions on anything else, but
I mean,
she
I don't
could.
have an issue with her having that as one of the issues because, as a woman,
Sure.
it's an issue that needs to be addressed. But does she have anything else? That's the other thing because
Well,
that's very
not on her political
interesting.
not on her website right now. So there's
Huh.
no political positions on there. And
Hmm.
I mean, the problem is if you go to the issues, the other party wins. But if you keep it on, you know, if you keep it on personalities, then she probably has a better chance of winning. So
Yeah.
I mean, she's been the candidate for. I mean, I know they're in the middle of their convention, but Biden stepped down a month
Yes.
ago,
Yeah.
and she hasn't had an interview with a single reporter. She's spoken,
Really.
but she hasn't had an off the cuff interview, and it's because she doesn't speak well off the cuff, and so they realize
Mm.
that, and so she's and they're keeping her away from the press. I don't know how much longer they can do that now that the
Yeah.
primary, I mean, the DNC is ending
Right.
probably tomorrow. So it's going to be difficult for them to keep hiding her and keeping her away from talking. And the other thing is there's uh, the third party candidate for Kennedy has announced he's going to address the nation on Friday. And there's pretty good indication that he's going to drop out of the race and endorse Trump.
Mm.
And that will shake up the race pretty big, because even if it's just a couple of points, that's a huge move in the battleground states that will
Right.
decide this election. So you can expect an earthquake in the election, and there with more earthquakes to come over the next couple of months before the election in November.
Yeah. This it feels like, I mean, the 2016 elections was a very interesting thing to watch over here as a Canadian. Um, this time around, it feels like it's going to be an absolute bloodbath. Um, and
Yeah, it will be either way.
definitely,
It will be either way.
yes, and it
I mean,
definitely.
I
I
mean,
think Canadians are in
Trump
fear over here.
Trump was criticized after, the 2020 election because of January 6th and
Yeah,
whatever happened at the Capitol. But,
yeah,
when he was elected in 2016, there were car burnings on the street, there were riots,
yeah.
and nobody was held accountable for that. So there's, this that bleeds into this whole argument that there's a double standard.
Hmm.
And if, there were some protests at the Capitol when Netanyahu from Israel spoke recently, and some defacing of the Capitol. Again, nobody was held accountable because they're kind of aligned with the opposing party. Uh,
Mm.
and so this whole concept of a double standard is really hard, and it really penalizes and does great damage to the criminal justice system. And we need to get away from that. And if we're going to do, I mean, throw the cuffs, throw the book, people hold them in jail for an issue that we don't agree with them on, then we need to do the same thing when someone from the opposing party does similar things, even if we agree
Absolutely.
with them. That's the reason why the symbol of justice is blind, on our on our statutes. We've kind of taken the blind and taken it off, and we're only. I mean, that's the problem with this whole. We're treating our political enemies one way, whether it's Joe Biden's son or whether it's the
Yeah.
lawfare against Trump. I
Yeah.
mean, all of that does great harm to the criminal justice system, where
Hmm.
people don't have faith in it. And when Trump gets found guilty of so many felonies and he goes up in the polls. I mean, what does that say about our system? And
Yeah.
I would argue, lawfare has worked so many times in the past. And so Trump is the first person that it hasn't worked on. If it doesn't work, it may end up working. He may lose. But there's no other Republican other than Trump that would have been able to stand up to it. And he's a billionaire, and they would say he's not. But I mean,
Oh,
it took
but he
someone of
is.
his stature, someone of his financial resources, to
Yeah.
be able to stand up to all this. And if Kennedy, who's the third party candidate, take drops out of the race and endorses Trump, it's also because of lawfare.
Hmm.
His vice president has spoken at length in the last couple of weeks about all the steps that the DNC has taken to try to keep them from getting on the ballot. So they have set up PACs that have one job, and that's to file suit in any state that they can to try to keep him off the ballot. And he has qualified for the ballot in every state with pending litigation in a bunch of those about whether he's going to be on the ballot. So those are problems that we have to. I mean, he's going to underscore all that and say that one party and one party only did all this lawfare to keep me off the ballot, and it was for no other reason than politics. And so, as a result of that, I'm endorsing Trump. And there's so many issues where that comes into play. I mean, if you look at the Democrat candidate for president, she has one policy or one position on crime, which, she hasn't said it out in writing, but
Hmm.
she agrees with this defund the police movement. She agrees with, you
Really?
know, uh, not prosecuting crime. She also um,
Huh.
did a tweet to support asking people to donate to a charitable bail fund when there were all these protests in Ferguson. She now denies that she did that, but the tweet is still there. So it's kind of
Yeah.
hard to deny it was there. Trump is running on a law and order type policy that we want to return law and order. We want public safety. We want people to feel safe. And the Democrat vice presidential candidate was at the storm of all that,
Hmm.
and so now he's trying to say he's law and order, but that's kind of contrary to the point. So
That
we
is.
just have it's going to be a very interesting time in the United States, and
Yeah.
this election will have a grave impact going forward on criminal justice and bail reform issues.
Yeah. That will be interesting. So, is there anything else that you kind of want to say, shed light on, when it comes to bail reform?
Well, I would say if people want more information on um, my organization or our group, you could go to pbtx.com. That's the Professional Bondsmen of Texas.com, or that's their website. We have a blog where we highlight important criminal justice stories in the news. We also have our own podcast, which is there's a link to it on the menu, but you can also go to thebellpost.com where we highlight just criminal justice issues all the time on our podcast. If you want to know what the New Jersey plan is, we have an episode about it. If you want to know what other states are doing and Texas is doing with charitable bail funds, um, we have multiple podcasts on that as we've updated and as different states have taken action on it. The purpose of what we're doing is just to try to be a resource to educate legislators and the public on these types of issues. And I think the lesson that I've learned from all this is if we're not telling our side of the story, which I think is the true side of the story, nobody's telling that side of the story. I mean, if I didn't come on here today and say the private industry bail system has the lowest failure to appear rate of any other release mechanism, and it's not even close, and that in California, misdemeanor courts across the state have an 80% failure to appear rate on simple release, you wouldn't even know it. You would
Yeah.
just know, oh, well, they're using it successfully in California. No, they're not. They're
No.
dismissing a great number of cases because people don't come back and you can't make them. And then they have a deadline to have the case tried. And so they're dismissing them.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I definitely wouldn't have known that. That it's as bad as it is. Like obviously you're gonna have people skipping, but I guess, you want to have hope that something is being done to get that person to be accountable, but that's apparently not happening.
Well, when the, when they're using a simple release mechanism, if they fail to show up, if they issue a warrant, that warrant's going down to the warrants department in, LA County. It's going to join tens of thousands of other
Yeah.
warrants being awaited to be served, which means they really are waiting for them to come back. They have to commit a new crime to come back into the system for them to get them back to that court. And that's really my criticism of, oh, well, we shouldn't punish them for oversleeping. We shouldn't punish them because they forgot the court date. Those failures to appear do the same damage to the criminal justice system, especially if they get scared then and then they don't come back to court because they're afraid of what's going to happen to them. I mean, those do the same damage to the criminal justice system as if they intentionally failed to come to court.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. Um and I guess the other thing that I want to maybe say, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, is um no matter what side of the fence you are on politically, um, go out there and vote. I think it's important. This election is going to be, um, I think, a very important one. I think that we've seen probably in a long time. So I would say, here as a Canadian, go out there and vote.
I would agree with that, but I would say, there are differences between the parties, and the biggest difference right now is public safety.
Yeah.
We've got one party that thinks that their supporters will ignore public safety as long as they agree with them on other issues. I challenge people this year to vote for public safety, because if you vote one time for public safety, then we will correct. Both parties will then support public safety again, and then we can go back to our normal fight. So I encourage people this election cycle to vote for public safety.
Yeah. And if you are unaware, maybe which party is maybe for or ignoring, or you just want more information, do your research. Research is
Absolutely.
your friend.
Yeah. Yes. And,
Yeah.
that's a big problem right now because look at the national level. Both parties are claiming to be the law and order party, and that's simply not true. You can look and see what their actions were in the past. I mean,
Yeah. I would have thought both were. Maybe one more extreme than the other. But that you're telling us otherwise, and that is I think I would never know that, and I'm sure um, many Americans are probably also just not aware of if they're just not doing the research. So that's very interesting.
well, it
Well,
shows you the callousness of one party that they think that they can fool people. And, you can fool
yeah,
people for a short period of time, but you can't fool them for a long period of time. And
exactly.
that's why we have backlashes, is because the electorate wakes up and then they realize, and we have a backlash coming, whether it's going to be this election, the next one, or the one after that. There will be a backlash. The reason why we
Mhm,
haven't had one so far, you could argue it's Trump or it's the abortion issue. It's a combination of everything.
mhm,
It doesn't really matter. I mean, it's done is forestalled or stalled the backlash because the public demands public safety. I mean, even the Democratic mayor of New York City, who's been fighting the extreme side of his party in New York, saying he's not lax enough, he probably said it best. He said, one of the foundations of society is public safety. And if you don't provide public safety, you don't have a society. And
right.
I would take it a step further and say the public will demand public safety. And if the government will not give it to them, then we will go through a period where they will provide it for themselves. And that's not good for anybody.
Yeah. 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 No, I agree with that. Public safety should be the number one. And I mean, if it's not, then you're just going to have everything kind of
Mhm.
just fall apart around it. And again, for our Canadian listeners, we've talked about it. I have family in the States. Mikkel has family in the States. Um, don't act like it's not happening that unfortunately the world, in particular right now, America is on fire. So definitely go to your family and just say, make sure you get out there and make sure you vote. It is crucial. So,
Well, and I would just end be aware where you are. I mean, when I went to
yeah,
college, I mean, my sisters were taught you don't go out at night by yourself.
I
You
still don't do that.
well, I mean, guys were different, but today I don't think anybody should go out at night by themselves.
Mm-mm.
I mean, my daughter is 25 years old and she's in LA County right now for 10 days of training. And she's told me, well, after work today, yesterday, she said, well, after work today, I'm just going to go to the beach. I'm like, by yourself?
Oh,
And she's like, yeah. And I'm like, you
no,
are freaking crazy.
no, I would never. I
Yeah.
mean, my co-host will joke with me and say, I don't know why you watch so much true crime. And I'm like, well, maybe, I'm a little crazy. But at the one side of it, it's like I watch it and I listen and I consume because I want to know as a woman what I have to look out for. It's unfortunate that I have to do that, but that is unfortunately the world that I live in. So I would never go to a public
Mhm.
place, especially in Los Angeles, by myself. I would, yeah, no.
Well, and I love my daughter to death, but when she was in college, she did a semester in DC where she interned at the White House. She was one of
Huh?
three interns in the West Wing of the White House every day. And I
That's
mean, she did it
amazing.
all on her own. And she was telling me, I got it. And I'm like, great, you can't go. So, because it was DC. It's a really unsafe place. But she was like living in a dorm 2 blocks from the US Supreme Court. And it
Hmm.
was, a great experience for her. And we went and we visited and we had a tour of the White House. But I mean, it'll be an experience she remembers for the rest of her life. But
Yeah.
I just remember when she went, I was like, you cannot go. That's not a place of high public safety. And you're just the type person that they like to pick on, especially if you go somewhere by yourself. So,
Yeah. Oh man. But I mean, that is definitely an amazing accomplishment. And it's unfortunate that it's just like, you have to worry about your safety just in all senses, even just being a woman, a young woman in the White
yeah,
House
yeah,
too. It's also that
a young
part.
woman.
Ugh.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I have a daughter. I mean, a daughter. I'm a father of 2 daughters. So
Yeah.
that's all I worry about. I've got
Yeah.
daughters.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Well, thank you
unfortunate.
so much for having me. I've enjoyed talking about these issues. I've enjoyed just kind of perusing a little bit about Canadian bail law and how the federal government kind of sets bail policy, and that's not the way it is in Texas. And it's really interesting because, the federal government tried to reform 20, 30, no, probably 50 years ago. And as a result of that reform, detentions went from 25% of those arrested to about 75% now. And
Mhm.
that was not the intent of those
No.
reforms. It was not to increase the number of people being detained pretrial. It was meant to let more people out. I'm kind of thinking that the reason that number is we have these presumptions and a large number of drug charges. And
Hmm.
so when the federal government steps in, and if there's anything that ticks a box, there's a presumption of that you're going to be detained, and that's just the consequences.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a
No.
consequence of accountability, and that's what's lacking at the state level. We just
Yeah.
don't have the resources for accountability when we get to these simple release mechanisms because we've been using the private sector at no cost to the taxpayers, and so they don't have the ability or the money to set up systems of accountability to replace something that they weren't paying for to begin with.
Yeah. No, I think definitely it seems like all roads kind of lead back to the accountability of it all. And
Yes, ma'am.
if, you know, people aren't held accountable, then that's also gonna make the system just fall apart, in which it is currently. So it's
Well,
Accountability, folks.
the vast majority of the United States still, follows the tried and true methods that we learn in our criminology classes of what works to decrease crime. So, the national statistics probably would say crime is going down, but that doesn't change the fact in our urban areas that, I mean, crime is running amok, and it's because it's a combination of this decriminalization. And they'll say, well, crime's not going up because this is no longer a crime. Well, when it's no longer a crime to steal under, $950, that does traumatic damage to the criminal justice system and to public safety. And we're seeing it. And we're seeing it as a result. They're trying to repeal it or modify it greatly on the November ballot in California. So I think I'm very hopeful for the future for the criminal justice system, because we're realizing that all these proposals that have been made by these think tanks that were not thought through, that were being, oh, we should try them, that these will work. Everybody just wants to go to court and resolve their cases. And we're learning that those were all just rhetoric, politics, and we're not based on science. And as a result, we're starting to roll back. New York has rolled back their bail reform 3 or 4 times now. California looks like they're fixing to roll it back again, and maybe even get rid of Gascon, which will send a big message to DAs that are being supported by this group across the country.
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on and talking to me about that. I think this is such an interesting topic. This was such an interesting conversation. I hope listeners kind of take from this. And of course, if you want to learn more, hear more, everything that you mentioned a little earlier, all the links, I will link it in our show notes,
Sure.
so that everyone can get more from you, because I think like this was an amazing conversation.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. Again, if you want to learn more, hear more, all the stuff from Ken W. Good, who was our guest on this episode, you can do so by going down to the links. You can get access to the website that he mentioned. I believe that there was a blog on the website, so you can take a look at that, as well as we'll link to his podcast so that you can get all of the information.